All right, well, I think we should just go ahead and start. Hi, I'm Allison. I'm the Electronic Resources from Wake Forest University, and we're going to talk about usage. Originally, this session was put together by Snoeyenbos, but she couldn't be here, so I'm kind of filling in as the moderator. So I guess we should just go ahead and get started. So do you want to say? Yeah. Go ahead.
Great. Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Liz Braun. I work at Project Muse, and so as we've said in our title, today we're going to go beyond usage. Actually, this is I can't really see people. Okay, there you are. Okay, I was like, something's different here. Anyway, I'm just going to make a few remarks to get us started. I'm sort of representing the point of view of a publisher, or actually an aggregator in the humanities. You probably know that Project Muse is a platform with an online collection of journals and books in the humanities and social sciences from nonprofit publishers, such as university presses and scholarly societies. And Project Muse is actually located at the Johns Hopkins University Press in Baltimore. And obviously, anyone involved in the creation of online resources, well, any resources actually, wants those resources to be used and read. Remembering, Ranganathan and the principles of library science, every book its reader, every reader his or her book, or whatever. I sort of think of it now as every online aggregation of humanities and social sciences content, its reader community. Yeah, it's always fun to riff on Ranganathan. So anyway, healthy usage is a goal for all of the stakeholders in the scholarly communication process: publishers, aggregators, librarians, creators, and users. And I think purveyors of online resources and publications certainly understand the concept of cost per use. Libraries certainly cannot afford to purchase resources that don't get reasonable use. So we publishers and aggregators work to make our resources easy to find in the first place and to use. And we work to make sure that our usage reports are accurate and provide what the libraries need. So compliance with Counter is a must, and I'm proud to say that our director at Project Muse has been on the Counter board for over 10 years now, so we are in it. So Muse is all in for usage, and our journals collection program actually pays royalties to our publishers in a revenue sharing model, and we do actually use usage to divvy up the royalties. But usage can be tricky, which I think is why we're all here today. Making something easier to use on your platform or through your discovery system to get to the content would also mean helping users get to the content they want without having to click around a lot to find that content. And I think that over time, interfaces improve to the point that overall usage on a particular platform could actually go down. Things are more efficient. I remember several years ago at a Project Muse annual publishers meeting, we were talking about usage going down a bit. I don't forget the exact context or what we were talking about, but our attitude was, as it usually is, like, oh no, and why is this happening? And one of our publishers, who is also a scholar and a user of resources, asked, well, why would that be a bad thing? Because, usage going down a bit overall could actually be a measure of success in some ways, or at least that's what I'm putting out. But also other things can affect usage. For instance, changes in Google's algorithms or indexing policies. What happens when Google suddenly decides not to index a particular product until it conforms with a new Google policy? It can happen. Obviously, a huge drop in usage could, or actually it would occur, and it could take quite a while to make the needed changes to your platform on your end, and then get that usage back up and going once Google starts indexing again. So Muse actually works very closely with Google whenever we make a change or improvement to our platform. We're talking with Google, we're making sure we're working with what they need on their end. Very important. But actually within Project Muse, we're an interdisciplinary collection, humanities and social sciences. Usage can vary across disciplines. Some fields are just smaller than others. Certain fields represented in Muse's journal collections get much higher usage. For example, we have some excellent journals in international relations. Those are some of our top used. But we also have some awesome journals in classical studies. And I mean, we're not going to say, hey, forget those classicists, so we're going to focus on international relations in order to make sure that we're getting high usage in the libraries. And I personally work with content at Muse, and when I need to do an assessment of how a particular journal is doing in terms of usage, I can't really compare that journal across all of Project Muse to get a good picture. The overall ranking of a journal amongst the other 650 or so journals might be interesting, but basically, if I'm really going to do an assessment, I'm going to work with subject groupings. So I don't compare the International Relations Journal to the Classics Journal. I also need to take into account that journals with several decades worth of content, or, that I put them on a more even playing field with the journals that are newer. So I use something as simple as hits per article or even hits per review to do comparisons. So anyway, I don't mean to get too far into that. I could talk about that for a while, but getting back to what we're talking about here, what I'm saying is usage is tricky. There are a lot of different things it's not just, it tells the whole story to look at one report of flat usage numbers from one resource to the other. And of course, any of us dealing with the publishing of humanities resources know that library budgets are certainly not getting bigger, and we are competing for dollars with the large, more highly priced STM resources. So there's a concern there. So for me, I'm just kind of leading off to say that I look forward to hearing from the librarians on the panel and how they assess collections and they use statistics, the roles that usage plays, additional metrics and other factors, also beyond usage, and how they could provide context. And just before we go into the rest, we were wondering how many in the audience were actually at libraries versus publishers, et cetera. So if you would indulge us with raising your hand if you're in libraries or librarians. Oh, cool. Oh, that's very useful for me. And how many of you are publishers or vendors or, okay, that's good too, represent. Okay, great. Well, thanks very much, and we'll move on to the next.
Okay, I'm Liz Siler. I'm the Collection Development Librarian at UNC Charlotte. And what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is sort of how I use usage statistics at my institution and how I imagine the majority of librarians here probably use usage statistics as well in terms of trying to make decisions about our resources. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is probably not anything new to a lot of you, but what I want to try to do is, at the end of our presentation, and why we kind of had everybody try to come forward and group up and things like that, is we want to make this an opportunity for people to talk with each other about their experiences. And so I want to kind of get your mind thinking about your processes and projects and things that you've done at your institution so that you can share that with each other at the end of our presentation. So usage statistics are great in that they tell us more about our resources than we probably ever knew before, and a lot of it was information we thought we knew, but we didn't have any actual data to prove it one way or the other. So they do tell us a lot of great information, like full text downloads, searches, page views, record clicks, time on a page, all sorts of information that we would never have known before. But it only tells us, a very limited amount in comparison to what might actually be happening. It doesn't tell us much about user behavior, what is downloaded or searched, and how much is downloaded or searched. If they download a book, do they look at one page? Do they read the whole thing? There's a lot of that kind of information that we just don't have or know. And so, oftentimes administration will ask you questions about the usage data you provide them, and there's only so much you can tell them. So, your usage can tell a story, and you can tell it whatever story you want to, but you only have, a limited amount of information to provide. So their usage stats can be used in various ways in order to tell your story about a usage or about a resource and how you make decisions about it. So helps you identify resources that are not being used to promote or cancel them. So one great thing that I've been working on at my institution is finding resources that seem to have low usage and working with liaisons to figure out a way to promote the usage as opposed to just looking at that usage, seeing it says 0 and saying we have to cancel it. For example, with one of my liaisons, we sent out a survey to her faculty to find out what resources were important to them, and at the end listed the resources that we had that were related to that subject area. And for several of them, they said, we didn't even know you had this, which is some kind of a scary situation, right? You know, you've been paying for something for years and years, and the people you were buying it for didn't realize you even had it. So in that situation, we knew from the survey and then from the usage statistics that those particular resources needed special attention to be promoted, included in class instruction and things like that, to be able to see if the usage could be increased. And then over time, over another couple of years, if we look and see it still didn't really help, then we know at that point that's a good time to consider cancellation. In other instances, usage could help you make the case to keep something that someone wants to cancel. An example of this would be very recently, I had given our biology department a list of titles that we have, because they had said that we never get them anything, which I had to prove to them that we do. We have lots of biology titles. But anyway, so I said, if there are any on here that you don't want to keep, we can swap them out for another title. And they wanted to cancel a title that they thought they didn't need, but when I looked back at the usage, it had an extreme amount of usage. And so in that situation, even though we got faculty feedback to say, you can cancel this, it really wasn't a good situation to actually cancel it. So usage helped us make that decision as well. And then it really helps to help, administration loves to see data. They want to see graphs, they want to see hard numbers to help make decisions about funding. So in my institution, we really are trying to push ebooks and ebook packages. So if we can show that ebooks that we had purchased previously are getting a large amount of use, then we can make the case that we should use money to buy more ebooks and add money to our budget so that we can continuously to buy more ebooks. So they can be very useful. Of course, usage data is only part of the story, and you really need to go out and get more information about all of your resources before making your decision. It can't just be that one data point. And one thing that it's hard to compare resources depending on the subject area, which is a little bit about what Liz was talking about. Because you could have a bunch of humanities ebook titles that don't get a lot of usage, and then you have a lot of science titles that do get a lot of usage, but what are your programs at your institution? Because at my institution, engineering is a huge program. Our humanities programs are not nearly as big, but that doesn't mean those resources aren't as valuable. So you kind of have to compare it to the size of the program and the usage that's being provided to you. So that's got to be a factor when you're thinking about it. And then the data can be interpreted one way or the other depending on what the results are and what story you're trying to tell. We have a really wonderful assessment librarian, and she's always saying, the data can tell whatever story you want it to. You have to look at it and say, what are you trying to say, and are you looking at it objectively, or are you looking at it so you can get the answer you're really looking for? So some of the really great things that you can get out of usage data is, of course, cost per use, which can give you a little bit more idea of whether that amount of usage is enough. So if you have 50 uses, but you pay $7,000 for a title, is that enough? Is that a good amount of usage? So that helps look at your usage a little bit differently. And as I already said, compare it to the size of the academic program you have on your campus and how many students or faculty would be accessing this. Usage. I don't know what that last point was. I'm trying to think about it. I have a cold, and I think my mind is sort of all over the place. So that usage might be minimized or maximized by the type of platform you're using, especially when you're talking about ebooks in particular, because depending on how the provider makes that ebook available, so if it's a one PDF download for the whole book, or if it's individual PDFs for every chapter, the usage will be inflated one way or the other depending on what you're looking at. So you can't compare one platform to another platform. You have to kind of look at it in a vacuum. So in terms of managing expectations, when you go to your administration and you're trying to make the case for something and you show them, I've definitely sat in meetings where I'll have a whole bunch of usage statistics on the screen and they'll see zeros and they'll say, okay, cut it, cut it, cut it. But you have to come back to them and say, we've got to think about that before we can just cut it. We have to get faculty feedback. We need to get, if the resource has a pretty high reputation, and it's something we need for accreditation or something like that. And then, of course, what are the department needs? Maybe this year it wasn't used, but maybe next year it will be. So those are all things that we need to think about before we cancel anything based solely on usage statistics. And one of the things, I've mostly been talking about Counter at this point, but you can get all sorts of usage data from your vendors, and you can also get data from Google Analytics or Lim Analytics or something like that. So maybe try to expand your scope of where you're getting your data from, not just your basic Counter data, but vendors have all sorts of data that I'm sure that they look at all the time. So maybe they'd be willing to share it with you so you can make a more informed decision. So yeah, I'm going to move on to Alice.
It's much harder when you're doing this in front of other people. Like at my desk, I'm a whiz. All right. I was really glad to see the hands of vendors in here because my presentation is more about dear vendors, which, of course, Liz kind of did the whole, Liz Siler did more of the library side, but I think that maybe sometimes when we talk to vendors don't quite understand what we as librarians have to evaluate. And so I kind of wanted to, oh, that's the wrong slide. Okay, so this is kind of my roadmap of where I'm going for vendors, and I hope that I'm kind of expressing what librarians are going through, but of course, since this is an interactive session, we'll find out. So for me, when I'm trying to think about usage, we come to sessions like this, we read articles, we ask colleagues for help or their ideas, and these are some of the questions that I ask myself, obviously not comprehensive, but these are some of the things that do go through my mind as I'm trying to figure out what is important. So hence begins the interactive session, because I don't think it's titled Lively Lunch, but we're going to go with that. Instead of people raising their hands, I want people to say if they agree or if they've thought about some of these questions, which I will ask individually. I want to hear, mm-hmm. You can say that any way you want. You can say it sarcastically. Mm-hmm. You can do whatever you want. I don't care as long as I hear people. It'll make me feel better. So let's make me feel good. Okay, does anyone who is a librarian, when you're thinking about how to evaluate usage, is one of the questions you ask yourself, do I emulate someone else's work? Mm-hmm, thank you, yes. Do I use a combination of different things I've learned? Mm-hmm, good. I don't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're supposed to be up here. Thank you. How do I interpret and use information that isn't standardized? Thank you. Appreciate you. Is there a cost savings opportunity? Thanks. Am I missing a major red flag? This is one that I freak out about all the time. Yes. Mm-hmm. Is someone else seeing something that I'm not? Yeah. I mean, I know I go to these sessions, I read articles, like I said, go to webinars, you're talking to your friends, your colleagues, anyone, and that's also something that I really worry about is there something I'm missing? Am I making good decisions? Okay, so this is the reality, and I'm kind of talking about to vendors here. Yes, counter reports matter. Absolutely, they matter. But they aren't the only thing, and I think Liz Siler kind of touched on that, the different ways that we evaluate things. And when counter reports are not available, it doesn't mean that we disregard a resource. There are plenty of resources that do not provide us counter reports, but we still find really important. For instance, institutional repositories, right? No counter reports. But I don't know of anyone who's getting rid of their institutional repository if they have one. Naxos, which is the musical database, I think that that's pretty much a staple in a lot of libraries. No counter reports, we're not cutting it. Well, we don't have it in my current library, but if we did, we wouldn't cut it. Art store, another staple, right, for most libraries. Yeah, no counter reports, completely useful. And then my next point is sometimes counter reports are not as relevant. So yes, we look at counter, we like counter, but we also recognize that they don't always tell the story. For instance, Tom, who is on our panel at the very end, Kanopy, it's just not as progressive. Like, we recognize this, right? There's some resources where it's just not going to work, and we have to be more creative or thorough in how we evaluate these resources. And of course, there are alternative methods that we've used. For instance, I know that I heard, I think it was Nevada State College, maybe, they were looking at their easy proxy logins to determine usage, which is really different. Like, I wouldn't even know how to start that, but I think it's a great creative way to evaluate usage. Google Analytics, I think Liz Siler mentioned, and let's see, there was another alternative method. I think talking to your faculty, like all of these things we think about in order to validate a resource. So I put if we are able, because I know everyone is in a different situation, and if is some people have autonomy to make decisions about their resources, and some people don't. You know, some people are getting their marching orders from an administration, and other people have enough trust in their institution, or have the trust of their institution or their library to kind of decide what they want to do. So if, capital letters, big block, bold, if we are able, we can try to determine the goal of the project. Sometimes it's identifying more popular resources. Sometimes it's identifying lesser used resources. Sometimes it's determining whether this resource is relevant or not. It just depends. Sometimes you're told what the goal of your project is. But if you get to decide, you can also decide how to tell the story. For instance, some people use cost per use. Some people use, I know there was a resource that I was looking at, we actually looked at the time spent on a particular resource. For instance, if I think it was probably Naxos, where I looked at the time that was used for each track, or the time spent on each track. You can get really creative if you have the autonomy to do so. And of course, goals can change. I know that my projects change from month to month, well, not month to month, but maybe year to year. And also, it can depend on the state of your budget if you're really constrained by money. So I was at a medium public teaching university, and I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the collection development and the situations. So before, I was with a state institution, and so a lot of our decisions had to do with money. And every year, it wasn't so much about collecting new resources. The reality was we're actually going to cut. And so we really had to look at the impact of each resource, because when we were going to cut, we were going to have to tell someone we're cutting that, and we had to validate why. So that was really hard, and I had a lot more autonomy in terms of being able to determine how to show impact. And now I'm at a medium private liberal arts research university, and the budget honestly is a little bit healthier. So we aren't as creative, in my opinion, about looking at the impact, but we do collect counter reports. It's more standardized, and it's probably because we haven't gone through a hard time. So that's kind of my comparison at this point. And I'm going to throw it over to Tom now from Kanopy.
Hello everyone, my name is Tom. I work at Kanopy. If you don't know who we are or what we do, we're a video streaming platform for libraries. I wanted to firstly apologise up front. I was also on a panel yesterday which was about impact analytics and talking about very similar topics today, so there will be a little bit of overlap in terms of some of the things that I say today. It's very hard to be invited for two panels on the same topic and come up with two separate sets of ideas. So that's just the first apology. And I'm also going to try really hard to slow my speech down. I got a bit of feedback yesterday that I talk really fast, and with my accent it makes it a little bit harder. So I'll try to talk slower. So what we're really here today, so I was invited on to talk on this panel. Obviously we've got the perspectives from two librarians up here. We've also got the perspectives of two vendors. We're a little bit different, obviously, than the Project Muse folks. We do video streaming, very, very different type of resource. And consequently, it's very different in terms of the ways in which you assess that resource and the types of metrics and things that will be important to you as a library vis-a-vis other resources that you have. But the real question we have today, and what we're here to talk about, is evaluation and assessment, the tools we use in order to do so, but really looking at data versus non-data and how we as a library can use data tools as well as non-data tools in order to make the best decisions that we are asked to do as librarians. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we do at Kanopy, but before I do that, I wanted to just reflect, take a step back and look at the history of assessment. When we look back in time, pre the 1970s, there wasn't really much done in libraries in the way of assessment. And the reason for that was that there wasn't really many tools in order to do assessment. There wasn't so much in the way of technologies for calculating circulation. So when we're doing things around circs and these other kind of metrics, there really wasn't the tools and technologies to actually get that information. And it was in the 70s when those sorts of tools started to develop. There was a really interesting paper which was written by these folks, Galvin and Kent. They came out in the 70s where they said, hey, like we really should be trying as best as possible to start to calculate this stuff, because our theory is that we're probably able to do better decision making and make better decisions for our library if we can actually make data-driven decisions. And so this sort of was the end of an era. This was the end of the era, which was all about volume and cost. Every library up until this point in time had always considered their success and their role on campus around volume and cost. How many books do we have in our library? The more books, the better we are, because we're a research institution. People walk in here to pick up books off the shelves. The more books we have, the better. And also we care about cost because we don't want to be spending too much money. And as soon as we got into this era where we could start to actually track usage and these sorts of things, we entered a new era, which was really around usage and ROI. It really started 2003. There was a really interesting study which happened up with the tri-colleges up in Pennsylvania, Bryn Mawr, Swarthmore and Haverford. They did a really interesting study where they looked at the last 10 years of circulation out of their library. This was obviously in 2003. Looked at the last 10 years of circulation in the library and found that 75% of all items in their library had not been touched. And suddenly we started to have, and this was replicated at lots and lots of other libraries, and suddenly, this was kind of proving that concept that data really matters, because if we, are not relying on data to help us to make the right decisions, then we're obviously making some decisions here which might not necessarily be the most effective cost or otherwise for users. In 2004, we had Counter, and we've had a bit of discussion about Counter today. We had it about yesterday as well. Ultimately, Counter is a really, really useful tool in terms of benchmarking different resources. It gets a little bit complicated when you're looking within certain resources, like particularly in video streaming. We talk about lots of different things which you can't compare to an ebook, for example. Like if someone's watching a film, you as a librarian probably want to know who was it, how long did they watch it for. Did they watch the whole thing? Did they create a clip of it? There's all these things around using a film that you care about as a librarian, but you can't really compare that to usage on an ebook. And so, Counter is really useful, particularly for comparing or creating a standard across resources, and then also it's looking at trying to get within resources and creating standards within those too. In 2004, we had our first ROI analysis. That was actually done at Drexel University, also in Pennsylvania. They were the first college to kind of come out and go, and we're going to do a cost per use type analysis. And that introduced a new methodology, which was like, okay, look, we really care about usage and we really care about cost. Let's merge the two. Cost per use is a really valuable metric for us to use to benchmark our resources. And then we started to see assessment departments come out. Now, we're starting to have a different conversation. This is a conversation which we've all had. We've talked about usage and ROI at all of these conferences, and we're starting to get a little bit bored about it. What we're talking about now, and this is really the thesis for the conversation today, is around impact. And we heard a lot from Liz and folks up here around how data is really helpful and usage is really good, and ROI is really interesting, and that helps us to make better decisions and judge resources, etc. But ultimately, it's not the end game. There's got to be something else there, something which moves beyond the data and looks at things which are a little bit more around impact. Because ultimately, as a video resource, if you see one play on a film, that's your usage data right there. That's really helpful. Okay, that resource was used, but it doesn't tell you much. And you're sort of sitting there going, was that a classroom, or was that a single user? Was it a faculty member? Was it a student? Did they like it? Did they hate it? Was the purpose for entertainment? Was it for education? Did it expand their mind? Did it improve their GPA? Like, you start to ask these questions, which really drives impact, because our role as libraries is not to drive usage. Our role as libraries is to make our kids smarter. and get them out there in the world. And we should be really benchmarking our performance based on how we drive our students and obviously patrons to become better educated. There's some interesting studies which are going on right now. Hofstra, I'm not sure, I know that Sarah's here, but she was toying with the idea of launching a study this year, but there was one which was done in 2015 by Murray State and JMU, which was a really, really interesting study. What they did is they looked at all the usage data on their library and they pegged the usage data to the actual students themselves, and then they actually looked for correlations between usage of the library on their campus and did those students get higher GPAs? Did those students, were they more likely to be retained and have higher retention rates at the campus? So suddenly we're starting to get into the area of impact analytics. Does use of the library lead to students getting better GPAs? Will it lead them to be more likely to stay within the college context? And this is kind of what we're getting at today. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing, because that's kind of like the context of what we're doing. Okay, so if the objective here is to try to get to the point where we can actually start to kind of calculate a little bit more around impact and move beyond usage, well, what can we do? And so we've been doing a couple of studies at Kanopy. We did one last year. I was actually on this exact stage last year presenting on the impact analytics side of things, but I'm going to give you a quick overview of what we did on that, and then I'm going to look at what we're really focused on this year, which is decision-making analytics. These are the libraries which we had involved in those studies. So let's just quickly look at impact analytics, which is the first one. First question you probably have is, hey Tom, what's impact analytics? It's easier to tell you what impact analytics is by telling you what it's not. Impact analytics are not usage statistics. Usage statistics tell us if someone used a resource. Impact analytics will tell us if that actually had an impact on them. What kind? Did it educate them? Did it help them to do better in their classes, or whatever that might be? And obviously we can start to think of a whole wealth of valuable opportunities which we can get if we can actually calculate and monitor that type of impact that certain resources are having. Then that can help us to make some much better decisions around processes, promotion, acquisitions out of the library. So this is just a quick example of how it kind of compares. So this is in the realm of video, this is the counter report for video. So if we were counter compliant as a video supplier, we provide you with a report looks like this, and it provides you a number of accesses by month. And it's really useful for benchmarking purposes, as I mentioned. You can obviously compare that to ebooks and other resources you have in your library. But ultimately, when we're talking about impact, we have to move the conversation beyond this. And this is when we start to get into things which look like this. This is our analytics dashboard, which we provide every library which we work with. It's a little bit overwhelming in terms of the volume of content that we have available there, but it just gives you a flavour for some of the kind of nice graphs and information which you can get from this. We've got 30 different analytics reports that we provide to libraries. Half of them are around usage and half of them are around impact. Now the usage ones are very obvious. It's usage by film, usage by subject, usage by producer, usage, did they watch the whole film, minutes, etc. But when we get into impact, we start to get into some really interesting areas. Here's some examples of how some of these libraries have been using some of these impact analytics which we now provide on the dashboards. This is Stanford University. They had a film which was called Twitch, and they were looking at their usage statistics on the film, and they noticed that it was played a couple of times in a period of a month. And that was really interesting to them, and they were like, oh, that's great, that's a good film, it's been used, we're really happy to see that usage. But ultimately, that's where the information stopped for them. And they didn't know what was going on with that film, did the people like it? But as soon as we actually start to provide them with a feedback loop around the impact side of things, these are the things which we call impact analytics, they noticed that the film was rated by 2 users, they rated it after watching it 5 stars, it's out of 5 stars, so they liked it. That film was actually included in 2 watch lists by users, so they can flag it to a watch list. One of the people who watched persons who watched the film were actually searching for genetic testing, so looking, obviously relates them to the kind of subject intention they had. And then one user actually posted a comment on the film, and this is a film which is about Huntington's disease. And when you see an anonymous comment posted by a user at Stanford, which is of that kind of genre, suddenly as a librarian you start to feel a little bit warmer and fuzzy about what's going on. Right? You look at the usage, you see 10 plays, but if you see that it's actually had a really powerful impact on a student, it makes us feel a little bit better about what we're doing. This is another example just at University of Florida. They were looking at some of their search term usage metrics, which they're using search terms also to gauge impact. And how they were doing that is they were looking at trying to link the search terms that users are using to actual things which are important on their campus. One of the biggest things which they had running on their campus at the time was, coming from the top down, was around stress-related issues on campus. There was a lot of anxiety, depression-related issues on campus, and so they were able to look at all of the search terms related to those types of things, like anxiety, depression, and actually link that to films being used for those purposes. Because if you know that someone's searching for depression and then they link to a particular film on it and then they watch it, that's obviously quite powerful for them to know. So they're able to report that information back up to the dean and administration provost to say, hey, like, here's some actual resources which are helping students to potentially grapple with some of these issues that they have, which we care about. Now, the next thing I wanted to jump into was decision-making analytics. And I kind of wanted to quickly switch into this because this is probably where we're doing a little bit more work right now. You know, we were talking last year about impact analytics and starting to capture some analytics which move beyond usage to things around impact, and that's kind of what I was showing before. And those slides I actually pulled from my presentation here last year. So I wanted to kind of get into, okay, well, what's next? And there's two big kind of themes that we're doing at Kanopy, because ultimately when we provide you with all of this information, there's two problems. One is information overload. And there's a lot of librarians I talk to and they say, wow, we've got 30 analytics reports here and you're giving me all this information, like usage by film and number of clips and playlists and all this kind of stuff, and it's a little overwhelming. I don't really know how to digest it, and can you summarize it for me in some ways that I can actually use it to make the right decisions? The second kind of thing, which is really important, is actually being able to interpret this kind of use in context. It's really hard for a university to look at these kind of information, usage and impact analytics, and make sense of them without being able to compare it to other institutions. And, you know, if I talk to, UNC, they're like, hey, like, how does that compare to, the other campuses in North Carolina? Like, how does that compare to Duke? Or, if I'm talking to Hofstra, they're like, how does my usage compare to some of the other campuses up here in New York? Because it's really hard for me to interpret this information without putting it in the context of what's also happening at other institutions. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a theme of we're moving on to beyond just like being able to calculate and log impact analytics into how can we actually use them. Here's some of the examples of the work which we've been doing on that. This was the second project which we've been working on, where we've been looking at trying to actually provide benchmark analytics to the universities we work with. And here's some of the examples that we did. This was Kansas University. We have a report on their dashboard which allows them to log accesses by source URL. So are our users coming from the learning management system in order to use this resource? Are they coming from the catalog? Are they coming from Google? Where are they actually coming from? And in the absence of actually having benchmarks, it's useful information because it gives them powerful information to kind of go, okay, well, maybe this is working, or it gives them information around what the intention of use is. If you know usage is coming from the LMS, the learning management system, you obviously know it's course related. But what's really powerful is when they can put it into context and see how that compares and contrasts across other institutions. We created a benchmark profile of institutions for them, and they could actually look at their usage and where it was coming from and compare that to other institutions. And you can see some interesting themes which are happening here. One of the first interesting themes is that they've got really strong website usage, which is coming from the actual library website, much higher than the average. So obviously their library website is a very effective tool for profiling and promoting usage. On the other hand, they're really low on social. Social media was just a slither of 0% at KU, whereas it's 5% at your average benchmark library. Now, this is really interesting in the context of other libraries. Also in the study we had Stanford and Brown. When they were looking at this, they had 10% which was coming from social. And so, they're obviously seeing a lot of kind of promotion which is happening at those libraries. Perhaps they've got stronger departments around that. But it was really interesting to kind of get some information around that. Another library which was in this study was Wisconsin. They had 40% of their usage coming from the learning management system, much higher than the averages. So that obviously was really interesting for them. I'm going to really quickly spin through this. Other kind of methods of benchmarking was around accessibility and devices. A really interesting thing for the Stanford and Brown folks also here was that they were seeing a lot higher use of accessibility metrics or tools on their website. So when it comes to video, obviously the number one accessibility thing is captions and transcripts. And so they were seeing about 4.4 to 0.6% of their users were actually using those tools when they're actually watching these films. The natural question came from them was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Why are we double the average in all these other campuses? The answer was because they've got much higher proportion of foreign language students at Stanford and Brown. They've got really big international programs and a lot of those students do that. So obviously there's a lot of English as a second language students there using these tools, and that obviously provides really valuable information to those libraries, puts it in context. They go, wow, okay, these captions and transcripts are really important to us. We've got a lot of students who are actually using them, and it's really interesting to put it in context of, well, how does that compare to other campuses? Also over here with devices, really fascinating insight came out of that. Rhode Island School of Design was one of the really interesting ones in this study. They had 11% of their usage coming from tablets versus the average of 4.5%. And so when you're Rhode Island School of Design, you see that, you start to go, okay, a lot of our users are using these tablets, these iPads. That's probably something really important to us. When we look at commuter campuses versus residential campuses, 6% of usage will come, or of students will use mobile devices to access these films, 3% at residential campuses. So it's really interesting to understand the profile of your user body in the context of other campuses, because that obviously impacts the way in which you need to deliver content. Also interesting was around timing. Rhode Island School of Design was, again, really, really interesting here. They had 15% of all video plays happen between the hours of 12 a.m. and 6 a.m., which was fascinating. These poor kids. But it was really interesting to kind of see that profile, because their library is looking at that. And in the context of that, that alone for RISD was really interesting. They're like, okay, wow, 15% of our students are kind of watching between these hours. Is that normal? And then we look at them and we gave them the actual averages, and we're like, no, the average is 5%. So it was actually really interesting for them, because it kind of like gave them a really interesting insight. Wow, like our students are like accessing things in these really obscure hours. That's obviously quite important to how we deliver resources here too. This is one final one, and then I'll be done. This was just subject usage. This was really interesting for Kansas, where they were looking at, okay, what's the kind of like usage of resources by subject vis-a-vis other kind of benchmark campuses. Anything right of the line means that they're seeing lower usage than benchmarks. Anything above the line is saying that they're getting more usage of those subject areas than other campuses on our platform. And so it's quite interesting for them, because it obviously gives them some feedback through to their liaisons, where they can say, hey, like we're getting really, really strong usage on foreign language and business on campus, so we probably don't need to do any promotion around there. That's great. But against benchmark, we're really not seeing much happening in teacher ed. Maybe we need to do a little bit of outreach there, because based on benchmarks, we would expect a little bit more usage or interest in that type of a collection. So what next? Okay, so as I mentioned, there's two, the kind of insights which I'm hoping to kind of share with you today is there's some really, really interesting new things which we're doing around calculating impact. The conversation has pretty aggressively moved beyond usage to impact. These metrics around usage and ROI are really valuable and really important, and they're always going to be there, but we're going to be combining that with a lot of kind of information which is a little bit more subjective around impact to complement the decisions we make as librarians. The next thing is that, we're pretty in the early days of this, right? So this is really interesting information I've been sharing with you, but it's really early days. And with time, we're going to see some more interesting trends. We're probably going to refine the type of metrics we calculate, the ones which we put more weight on versus less out of the library, and also particularly how we actually integrate that into our library and the processes that we do. The big area which we're really focused on now is now we've got these impact analytics down pat, and we can start to calculate and grab them. How do we actually kind of condense those and summarize those in a way in which libraries can actually make the right decisions? And there's two ways around that. I mean, there's two really big threads in that. One is the benchmarking side of things, so being able to provide you with benchmarks so that you can actually look at your usage and impact analytics in context and compare and contrast. But the other really big thing is actually taking all of this wealth of information and putting it into a format which is most simple or easy for you to kind of actually use in making the decisions for your library, which are most important. And I think that's all I've got. Thanks.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions about our presentation, or before we kind of break off into small groups and I pull up the questions. No? Okay, so your comment was basically to find a better way to resolve how to figure out usage between majors and resources. Is that right? Okay. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I think that kind of, I think that's a question that we all ask ourselves when we're doing the evaluations is, what is the true impact? You know, how do you do it for programs that are really tiny versus programs that are really large where you could default to a report, right? So yeah, I certainly don't want to answer for everyone, but I think in my experience, it would be looking at the resource and using your faculty and using the liaison relationships that you have to really see, even if the impact, or even if the usage is very low, that doesn't mean that there isn't an impact. But I think it takes a lot of communication and time. Does anyone else?
Yeah, I think if you want to find the impact you're having on a particular subject area, you're just...
Do you use the microphone?
Yes.
Is that one?
If you're trying to find the impact for a particular area, a lot of that will have to do with outreach to that area. It can't. You can only go. I feel like some of the statistics can only go so far in telling you what you need to know. I mean, if you have a really close relationship with your faculty and work with your liaisons and try to get an idea of what what faculty are using in their classes, what are they encouraging their students to use, things like that, then you would have a better idea of what is making an impact on your users. I think you have to have some of that dialogue. You can't just have data, because that will only get you so far.
Yeah, I'll just add a little comment over here. I think where you see what's really important is looking at other campuses as well, because I think in the context, particularly just of our resource, but I'm sure this is a comment more broadly, is that it's really hard to look at one subject area and another subject area and compare usage and say one's failing, because in the context of our resource, at least being a video resource, we're naturally going to have more relevance to a film studies course or a foreign language department than we might to medicine, where they don't necessarily make much use of our resource. So it's very difficult for you just to look at a subject level analysis and go, oh, we're seeing low use of this resource in the medical department, but we're seeing high use in the foreign language department, therefore the medical department's not doing a good job. That's obviously, it's related to the actual resource itself. But I think where the interesting thing comes in is with the benchmarking, because what would be a potential kind of insight, and this is kind of goes what to you were saying, looking at the engineering department versus the other departments on campus, you need to be careful because engineering is a really important department to your campus. And I think in the context of a campus like yours, what you might be more interested is looking at, okay, what's the use of this resource by our engineering department on campus? How does that compare to the engineering department over there that we really peg our performance against? And that's going to be a really interesting comparison. Yeah.
All right, well, I think that was, oh, I'm sorry, did you have a question? Do you want to use the, wait.
Using statistics doesn't tell us much about how the students are using the information for success. So I'm interested in the impact, what do you call it, the impact analysis that you talked about, because using a particular resource doesn't mean that they are using it successfully. It doesn't mean that they are using it towards anything. It doesn't mean that they are getting all the information necessary for being successful. So how do we, if you could talk more about the impact of those resources, how can we measure the impact of our resources? That is what is interesting to me.
I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? Yeah, I mean, it is challenging, and we can only go so far. We'd love to be able to gauge perfectly the impact every resource is having, but ultimately we're constrained by technology, the capabilities that we can actually do around that. I think that what we're talking about today has been around, we're developing very, very rapidly in the right direction. I mean, if you remember that first slide I put up there, which was the history of assessment, like that was a 30, 40-year timeline of developing, where we went from just being volume-based to looking at circ data to thinking about ROI. And now, and if you look at the last 3 years, the development in the last 3 years has pretty much been the same leaps and jumps that we've had in the previous 40 years. So we're moving very, very fast. So where we are right now is, I think, we're definitely not there. I think, you know, the reality is right now that we can provide you information as a vendor, and we provide as much as we can. Like, there's nothing else that I can possibly think to not give you. But, you know, when you're looking at a film and you're thinking, to your question, like, what is the impact of this film on my campus? And we're giving you everything we can. We're like, here's the usage. It was a professor made a clip of it and was used in class. It was embedded in the learning management system because we can see that, you know, 20 players came from the LMS. A student commented on it after they watched it. So we're giving you all of the information surrounding the use of that film to try to piece together that impact. Now, I think the challenge for us is not so much getting that information. The challenge is, how do we actually get that information in a way that can help to make the right decisions? Because it's not practical for you to go and look through the information on 1,000 different films to gauge, you know, which are the right ones. It's like, how do you condense that information for me in a single report which says, hey, here's the 10 films that are most critical and having the best impact on your campus right now. Just one simple report. That's the key thing. So I think that moving forward, to your question, the challenge will be, okay, how do we actually grab all of this information that we're getting and condense it into a way which I, as a librarian with limited resources and time, can actually use it.
Okay, we really did. Oh, I'm sorry. Go. Yeah.
Just related to that, I'm just wondering, so how are we measuring who's actually using them? Because like, what faculties are coming, using those particular resources? Are you measuring that in some way? What, you know, how do we know that a sociology student is using this film, and what about a medical student, and the impact on those particular faculties?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And I'd love to be able to tell you, but the reality is that there's privacy, right? And yeah, so
like, some resources require each student to create an account, and some of them you can ask at that point, you know, what faculty, they go granular that way, without, you know, going into, because we use easy proxy, so we can keep track where people are coming, you know, which IPs or which buildings they're coming from, or things like that. I wasn't sure if that was something that was tracked in terms of user accounts.
yeah, I mean, it can be done. The reality is, you know, there's two major benefits. Like, if we were able to ask people, who are you? Give us your personal information, and then we kind of clock what they do based on that. There's two major benefits from that. One major benefit is what you're saying, which is like, it'd be really valuable for me as a librarian for assessment if I can look at usage and divvy it up between student versus faculty, and even within faculty, which department they are. Like, there's really valuable information which we could get if we're getting personal, you know, down to the user data. The other really valuable thing is actually curating the experience that your patrons are having. Like, if you think about when you guys go and log into Netflix, or you log into any other resource that you use in a personal capacity, they don't just service up a one-size-fits-all experience for you. When you log into Netflix and you're watching all of these, you know, documentaries, then they're going to start profiling documentaries on your homepage. If you're watching all of these political dramas, they're going to start profiling House of Cards on the homepage. So there's another major benefit from getting down to the user level, where we can actually start improving the user experience for users, which ultimately means we have bigger impact too, because obviously if we can enhance that user experience, if we've got like a sociology professor, to your example, then obviously we can kind of curate the experience. They come in, they log in, it's like, hey, we know you're a sociology professor, so we're going to make sure it's all sociology stuff profiled here. The biggest challenge is privacy and technology. And, you know, with a lot of libraries, they use proxy, so we've got these anonymous people coming in. So what we try to do is two things. One is that we try to curate things for the anonymous user. So if you come in and you're a sociology professor, you start clicking around on the website. We don't know who you are, but we now know that you are on this website, and we've tracked that you've just clicked on 5 sociology films. So if you go back to the homepage, we start to curate the homepage to be sociology. So that's one thing we can do. The other thing which we're doing is just grabbing as much circumstantial evidence around the usage so that you can infer it. So like you're looking at a film and you're like, okay, I see 100 plays in one day, probably was just sent out by a faculty member. It's a race studies film, probably the race department. Or I can see that a clip was made of that film, and the clip was entitled Race 101. You know, you can. So it's about trying to give you the information on the edges so that you can make those inferences. But it's it's really hard.
I should maybe just leave the mic with you.
Actually, I just want to join in the discussion of what you mentioned. Is that is our $1 million question, and I think that easy proxy is the biggest limitation. I think if we were to go to single sign-on, that information would be captured, and not necessarily that librarians would have to violate anybody's rights, but we could probably work with our institutional effectiveness reporting people and collapse it down to, seniors, gender, majors, minor, and that in itself would be really helpful. So far, the only direct link I have is when I'm the liaison for the business department. The technology is still so new that they're coming to me and asking, So I mean that's what I know. I mean, but that's it. But I do think there's a possibility to build these information structures to inform us on these things. But I think it's kind of the next step. Like we have to do single sign-on. We have to work with other university departments to bring it together.
Thank you. Well, we really did want to have people interact and kind of share their own experiences. So we came up with some questions here. Obviously, we're not going to get to all of them. But if you want to break up into small groups, maybe 5 or 6, don't turn anyone away if someone wants to join your group. But also, I'd like to ask vendors if you could join a group, because we really want your participation in this, and we want you to hear what librarians are going through in terms of the process of analysis and how they interpret usage. So make sure, vendors, that you are in a group, not just a group of vendors. But librarians, please let vendors in your group. But the first question is, has anyone worked on a project utilizing statistics to drive your decision? Excuse me. So if you could just kind of, if you want to just talk with the people around you, that would be great. And I'll give you a few minutes, and then hopefully someone will have a great story to share. Yes, I'm sorry.
All over campus for everything. And so they have to log on to the computers in the library so we get their information